Here is something most people who have put hundreds of hours into Bloodborne still do not fully understand. The city of Yharnam was not built for humans, and almost everything you were told about its founding is a deliberate lie constructed by the people who destroyed it. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I want to be upfront about something before we get into this. I have been researching Bloodborne's lore for a long time, and this video exists because I kept running into the same problem. Every time I thought I understood one piece of the puzzle, 3 more pieces showed up that contradicted everything. So I decided to put together the most comprehensive breakdown I could manage, focusing on the secrets that most lore videos either skim over or miss entirely. One specific choice I made when assembling this: I deliberately front-loaded the founding history of Yharnam and the Pthumerians before anything else, because I think most of the confusion people have about the game's later revelations comes from not having that foundation. I also excluded a lot of the more speculative fan theories that I could not trace back to at least 2 in-game sources, even if some of them were fascinating. What you are getting here is interpretation, not confirmed canon. With that said, let us get into it. Yharnam is old. Not old in the way that most fantasy cities are old, where you get a few crumbling ruins and some vague references to a founding king. Yharnam is old in a way that suggests the city existed in some recognizable form before most of the human civilizations that surrounded it had even developed written language. The evidence for this is scattered across item descriptions, environmental details, and the way certain NPCs speak about the city's history. But when you start pulling the threads together, a picture emerges that is genuinely unsettling. The Pthumerians are where this story actually begins. They are a people who receive almost no direct attention during a standard playthrough of Bloodborne, because most of the content dealing with them is locked behind the Chalice dungeon system, which a significant portion of players never engage with deeply. This is, in my opinion, one of the biggest structural secrets in the game. From Software essentially hid a large chunk of the foundational lore inside an optional content system that the game barely explains and never pushes you toward. It suggests that the people who created Bloodborne knew that certain players would dig for this material and others would not, and they were content with that division. The Pthumerians were not human, or at least not fully human in any way we would recognize. Item descriptions in the Chalice dungeons refer to them as a people who communed with the Great Ones long before the scholars of Byrgenwerth ever arrived. And they built their civilization in the underground labyrinth specifically to be close to something that rested beneath the earth. What that something was is never stated with complete clarity, but the architecture of the Chalice dungeons points toward one possibility. They were built around tombs, specifically the tombs of Great Ones, and the Pthumerians served as custodians of those tombs in a role that was simultaneously religious and deeply practical. The custodial role is interesting because it implies a transaction. The Pthumerians were not simply worshippers, they were stewards. And stewardship of that kind, in the world of Bloodborne, always comes with a cost. The item descriptions for several Pthumerian artifacts suggest that this communion with the Great Ones gradually changed the Pthumerians at a physiological level. Their queens, in particular, appear to have undergone changes that moved them further and further from whatever they had originally been. The Pthumerian queen, encountered in the deepest Chalice dungeons, is humanoid in shape but clearly something else in substance. Her attacks involve a kind of eldritch energy that elsewhere in the game is associated only with Great Ones and those who have been fundamentally altered by contact with them. This matters for the history of Yharnam, because the city above the labyrinth was not built independently. The surface city and the underground labyrinth are the same civilization at different levels. The people who eventually called themselves Yharnamites were at some point in the distant past either Pthumerians themselves or a people who inherited Pthumerian structures and then forgot what those structures originally were. This forgetting is not accidental. It is a consistent pattern throughout Bloodborne's history. Knowledge that could destabilize the current social order gets buried, relabeled, or destroyed. The Healing Church is the most obvious example of this pattern, but it did not invent it. The pattern was already in place when the church was founded, because the church was founded by people who knew exactly what was under Yharnam and chose to build an institution specifically designed to control access to it. Master Willem of Byrgenwerth sent his students into the labyrinth to collect Pthumerian artifacts and old blood samples, and what his students found down there is what eventually caused the split between Byrgenwerth and what became the Healing Church. The nature of that discovery is one of the most layered secrets in the entire game. What Willem found, or rather what his student Lawrence found and then hid from Willem, was that the old blood had a specific and repeatable effect on human cognition. It did not simply heal the body, it altered the brain. And the alteration, when controlled carefully, produced what the scholars at Byrgenwerth had been searching for, a genuine expansion of human insight, an ability to perceive things that ordinary consciousness could not access. Willem wanted to achieve this expansion through a different method, one that he believed was safer and more fundamentally transformative. He believed that adding eyes to the brain, literal physical transformation of the mind itself, was the path to understanding the Great Ones. Lawrence believed the old blood was a shortcut to the same destination. They were both right, and they were both catastrophically wrong. And the disagreement between them set everything else in motion. The founding of the Healing Church was therefore not a religious event in the traditional sense. It was a scientific schism that got dressed up in religious language, because religious language was a better tool for managing a population. Lawrence understood something that Willem apparently did not, that most people cannot handle the truth of what the Great Ones represent, and that an institution which promised healing and asked for faith in return was far more stable than one which promised cosmic insight and asked for physical transformation. The church gave people blood administration. It told them it was holy. It told them it was a gift. It did not tell them where the blood came from or what it was doing to them over time. The layering of deception here is remarkable. The Healing Church deceived its congregation about the nature of the blood. The upper echelons of the church, the choir and the higher-ranking hunters, knew more about the blood's true origin, but still operated within a framework that obscured the deepest truths. And even at the very top, among the scholars who had direct contact with the moon presence and the other Great Ones, there is evidence that the full picture was never clearly understood. The Great Ones themselves seem to operate on a level of intention that makes it genuinely unclear whether they were deceiving anyone or simply existing in a way that human minds could not fully process. The moon presence is the most important entity in this regard. It appears in Bloodborne as both the force behind the hunt and as the entity that grants the player character their hunter powers in the game's implied prologue. The contract the player character enters into is never shown directly, which I think is one of the most interesting narrative choices in the game. You wake up already bound to the moon presence. The deal has already been made. You are already inside the system, before you are capable of understanding what the system is. This mirrors the situation of Yharnam itself. The city was already bound to the Pthumerian labyrinth, and the Great Ones beneath it during the game's timeline could have remembered why. The inheritance of that binding, across generations, is what produced the scourge of the beast. Because the old blood was always carrying something with it, the Healing Church thought it could manage the blood's transformative effects through careful distribution and spiritual guidance. It was wrong, and the streets of Yharnam on the night of the hunt are the result of that wrongness. I want to spend some time on the scourge itself, because I think it is frequently misunderstood as a kind of infection, like a plague that the church accidentally spread. This is a partial reading. The scourge is an infection in a mechanical sense, but what it is infecting people with is something more specific than a disease. It is, based on the evidence available, a forced partial transformation toward a state of consciousness associated with the Great Ones. The beast form is not simply a degraded animal state. It is a failed transcendence. The people who transform into beasts are people whose bodies and minds could not handle the cognitive expansion that the old blood was pushing them toward, and they collapsed into something that retained the aggression and physicality of the transformation, without the elevated perception that was supposedly the point of it. This is supported by the fact that beasts in Bloodborne retain some human behaviors, They congregate, they respond to fire with something that looks like fear. Some of them, particularly the ones that appear to be more recently transformed, behave in ways that suggest they are still partially aware of what they were. The cleric beast, the first boss in the game, was once a leader of the Healing Church. The fact that it retained enough identity to be referred to by its former role suggests that transformation into a beast is not a complete erasure of the self. It is a shattering of it. The hunters exist within this context as a kind of controlled response to an uncontrolled problem. The first hunters predate the Healing Church and are connected to Yharnam, who is himself connected to the moon presence, in ways that the game reveals only gradually. Yharnam built the hunter's dream and the workshop as spaces outside the normal flow of time in Yharnam, and he did this in service of the moon presence, which apparently needed the hunt to continue for reasons that are never fully explained but strongly suggested. The moon presence needs the hunt because the hunt produces something. What it produces is a matter of interpretation, but the most coherent reading, to me, points towards something like cultivated awareness. The cycle of hunting and dying and being revived in the dream, repeated endlessly, produces a kind of consciousness in hunters that is different from ordinary human consciousness. It is heightened by proximity to death, sharpened by constant exposure to things that should destroy the mind, and eventually capable of perceiving the Great Ones directly. The moon presence is, possibly, farming hunters in the same way that the Pthumerians farm the proximity of the Great One's tombs. It is creating conditions that will eventually produce a mind capable of ascending to its level, and it is doing this because Great Ones mourn the loss of their children and seek to reclaim them. The detail about Great Ones and their children is one of the most quietly devastating things in Bloodborne's lore. It appears in the description for the 1/3 of umbilical cord, which states that every Great One loses its child and seeks to reclaim what was lost through a surrogate. This is not metaphorical. The Great Ones in Bloodborne appear to be entities that are capable of a kind of grief, and that grief is the engine driving much of what happens in the game. Murgo is a child. Iosifka's transformation relates to her attempt to become a vessel for a Great One's child. The entire structure of the game's hidden narrative is about entities trying to fill an absence that cannot be filled. Understanding this changes how you read Yharnam. He is not simply a jailer in the hunter's dream, or a puppet of the moon presence. He is also a grieving person who lost someone, specifically Lady Maria, and who has been trapped in a simulacrum of that loss ever since. The dream itself may be a reflection of Yharnam's grief, as much as it is a tool of the moon presence. The doll he created, the one the player character interacts with at the dream's lantern, is a constructed substitute for Maria, a replacement child for a replacement loss in a world where everyone is trying to replace something they cannot get back. The geography of Yharnam reinforces all of this. The city is built in layers, and each layer represents a different period of its history and a different relationship to the truth of what lies beneath it. The surface streets where most of the early game takes place are the most recent layer, the veneer of a functioning religious city. Below that are the forbidden woods and the places the church has sealed off. Below, that is the old Yharnam, which burned once and was sealed away and is now populated entirely by beast-type enemies who were once the church's own hunters and congregation. Below that is the labyrinth, which is where all of this began. The sealing of old Yharnam is worth examining closely. The church did not simply quarantine the old district because it burned. It burned because the church burned it. This is implied strongly by the presence of church hunters in old Yharnam, who behave as though they are still on a mission, still patrolling, still burning. The implication is that the church executed everyone in old Yharnam to prevent the spread of the scourge, and then sealed the area to prevent anyone from finding out what had been done there. The church servant enemy type in old Yharnam carries fire and uses it aggressively, which is consistent with a burn and seal operation, rather than simple quarantine. The timing of this purge matters for the larger narrative. If old Yharnam was burned and sealed before the events of the game, it means the scourge had already reached catastrophic levels at least once, and been suppressed through mass killing. The night of the hunt, depicted in the game, is not the first such night. It is a recurrence of something the church has been managing through periodic violence for a long time. The hunters the player character encounters throughout the game are operating within a system designed to manage exactly this kind of recurrence, and most of them are either unaware of the full scope of what they are part of, or aware of it and too deep in to escape. Hunter Eileen fits this description precisely. She hunts hunters, specifically hunters who have begun to slip toward frenzy, or worse, who have lost themselves in the blood or the hunt to the point where they have become more of a threat than the beasts they were supposed to stop. She operates with a kind of resigned clarity, which suggests she has been doing this long enough to understand that the cycle does not end, that there will always be more hunters who break, that her job is permanent. Her quest line, if followed to its conclusion, ends with her passing the torch to the player character, which is not an optimistic gesture. It is an acknowledgement that the role of hunter-killer is a permanent necessity in this world. The insight mechanic in Bloodborne, the number that goes up when you encounter great ones and goes down when you use certain items, is the game's most direct representation of the law's central tension. More insight changes what you can see. At certain thresholds, enemies that were invisible become visible. The world begins to show different details. The amygdalae, the enormous spider-like great ones clinging to the architecture of Yharnam, cannot be seen without sufficient insight. They have apparently always been there. Everyone in Yharnam who has had any exposure to the old blood has been living in proximity to these entities without being able to perceive them. The church knows about them. The scholars of Byrgenwerth knew about them. The ordinary people of Yharnam do not know, and the question of whether that ignorance is a kindness or a cruelty is one of the things the game never definitively answers. My reading is that it is both, and that the ambiguity is intentional. The Great Ones are not evil in any straightforward sense. They are not trying to harm the people of Yharnam out of malice. They are simply operating at a scale and in a mode of existence that makes the concept of harm essentially irrelevant to them. An amygdala, sitting on a building in Yharnam, is not threatening the people below it in the way that a predator threatens prey. It is more like a geological feature that happens to be animate. The danger comes not from the Great One's intention, but from proximity and from the human attempts to understand and interact with them. This is what makes Byrgenwerth such a fascinating and tragic institution. Master Willem and his students genuinely wanted to understand. They were not primarily motivated by power or by the healing benefits of the old blood. They wanted to know what the Great Ones were, what the universe looked like from the perspective of an entity that could perceive things beyond ordinary human cognition, and whether humanity could reach that level. The tragedy of Byrgenwerth is not that its scholars became corrupted by forbidden knowledge. It is that some of them genuinely began to approach the answers they were looking for, and the cost of that approach was everything that makes human life worth living. Willem himself sits in his wheelchair at the edge of a lake for the entire game, unmoving, staring at the water with eyes on his hands where fingers used to be. He is still conscious, he is still perceiving, but he is perceiving things that are so far outside the scope of ordinary experience that he no longer functions in any human sense. He achieved what he was looking for. He became something that could see further, and the result is a man who cannot speak, cannot move meaningfully, and exists in a state that looks from the outside like profound incapacity, but may from the inside be something extraordinary. The game does not resolve this ambiguity, and I think it is right not to. Mikolash is the other side of this coin. He spent his life in the school of Mensis, trying to make contact with Murgo, and through Murgo with the cosmos, and when the school conducted their ritual, he got what he wanted in the worst possible way. The entire school of Mensis went mad simultaneously in an event that the game implies was instantaneous and total. The scholars of Mensis are now wandering the nightmare, wearing cages on their heads to keep their own brains from leaking out, and Mikolash among them has been conducting a one-sided conversation with Murgo ever since, offering the player character a call beyond, as though they are a fellow seeker who will understand his ravings. His dialogue is usually read as comedic because it is delivered in a theatrical, absurdist register. But underneath the theatrics, Mikolash is describing something real. He got contact with the Great One. He got the cosmic insight he was looking for, and it broke every social and cognitive structure he used to organize his experience, leaving behind only the raw ecstasy of contact and the inability to do anything with it. He is, in a sense, the end point of the path that Lawrence started and Willem tried to redirect. This is what happens when a human being makes direct contact with what the Great Ones actually are, the nightmare that Mikolash inhabits, and that the player character must navigate to reach him, is one of several dreamscapes in Bloodborne that function as extensions of Great One consciousness. The Hunter's Dream is the most prominent of these. The Nightmare of Mensis is another. The Fishing Hamlet Nightmare, accessible only in the Old Hunters DLC, is a third. Each of these spaces is a place that exists in a reality adjacent to Yharnam, accessible only through specific conditions, and each of them represents a different relationship between human consciousness and Great One influence. The Fishing Hamlet is particularly important for understanding the full scope of what happened before the game's main timeline. It contains evidence of an encounter between early hunters, possibly the very first generation of hunters, under Gehrman, and a Great One called the Orphan of Kos. What happened at the Fishing Hamlet was a massacre. The hunters killed everything in the hamlet, harvested parasites from the body of Kos, and used those parasites in experiments that eventually fed into the Healing Church's later work. The hamlet's denizens, fishermen who had been transformed by proximity to Kos in ways that were unusual, but not hostile, were slaughtered not because they were dangerous, but because they had something the hunters wanted. The Orphan of Kos is the child of Kos, born from her corpse, and it carries with it a grief and a fury that the player character has to withstand and overcome. The curse on the Fishing Hamlet. The reason the nightmare exists and continues to trap those who enter it comes from Kos herself. Her final utterance before death was not a scream of pain. It was something closer to a judgment. The nightmare is the consequence of what was done there, a permanent mark on the fabric of the world, and it has been trapping hunters ever since as a kind of ongoing consequence that never actually resolves anything. Ludwig is in this nightmare. Ludwig, the Holy Blade. The first of the church hunters, the man whose blade became a symbol of the Healing Church's authority, is in the Fishing Hamlet nightmare, transformed and not remembering who he was. His quest line in the DLC is one of the most emotionally complex things in any From Software game. You find him monstrous, you fight him, you defeat him, and then you have the choice of whether to show him his holy blade or something else. If you show him the blade, he remembers. He remembers who he was, what he stood for, and what he did, and the horror of that remembrance is written all over the way he speaks in his final moments. The holy blade, Ludwig's signature weapon, was found somewhere and repurposed, turned into a symbol. Ludwig built the church hunter system on a foundation that he believed was righteous, and he spent his existence in the nightmare unable to remember whether any of it was real. The moment of remembrance before his death is the game saying something important, that the truth, even when it destroys you, is better than the comfortable forgetting that the church offered its hunters. This is the thesis of Bloodborne's entire narrative, stated through the death of one former soldier. The hunter Dürer in Old Yharnam complicates the picture further. He is not a beast. He is not mad. He is a hunter who stopped hunting and has been sitting on a Gatling gun tower, watching over the beasts of Old Yharnam ever since. His questline, approached carefully, reveals a man who looked at the beasts of Old Yharnam and decided that they were more human than the institution that created the conditions that transformed them. He protects beasts. In a game full of hunters who treat the hunt as a duty or a calling, Dürer is the one who looked at what he was doing and declined to continue. What makes Dürer interesting lore-wise is not simply his choice, but its sustainability. He has apparently been sitting on that tower for a long time, watching the beasts below him, shooting any hunter who comes near them. He is not transformed. He is not broken. He is maintaining a position through sheer persistence in a world that constantly pressures everyone toward either hunting. His existence is evidence that choosing neither is possible, at significant cost, and it raises the question of how many other hunters in Yharnam's history looked at what they were part of, and found no option short of Jura's radical withdrawal. The Powder Kegs are another hunter faction that pushes against the church's mainstream approach. They built weapons the church disapproved of, specifically explosive and firearm-focused armaments that the church considered unsanctioned, and they worked outside the institutional framework in ways that made them simultaneously valuable and politically problematic. The weapons they left behind, accessible throughout the game in hidden or off-path locations, are often among the most unusual and powerful in the game, consistent with a group that prioritized effectiveness over institutional approval. The fact that multiple hunter factions exist and existed in Bloodborne's world, many of them at odds with the Healing Church, suggests that the church's control over the hunt was never as complete as it presented itself to be. There were always people operating in the margins, hunting with different methods and different purposes. The night of the hunt, depicted in the game, is a night when those margins become more significant, when the institutional structures that kept the various factions in a working relationship have collapsed, and everyone is operating according to their own principles. The blood-starved beast, encountered in Old Yharnam after defeating the area, is a creature that has been so deprived of blood that it has degraded into a purely instinctual state. The item description for the Pthumeru chalice, found after its defeat, connects it to the earliest period of Pthumerian interaction with the Old Blood, and suggests that this specific type of degeneration, the total loss of cognitive function through blood deprivation rather than through overdose, was documented even in Pthumerian times. The blood-starved beast is not a unique tragedy. It is a pattern with a documented history. The mechanics of blood consumption in Bloodborne, the fact that hunters consume blood to level up and become stronger, implicates the player character in the same cycle the game is documenting. Every level is a dose. Every dose is a step in the same direction that everyone else in Yharnam has already taken. The game is not subtle about this implication. The very first interaction with the doll involves her handling blood for the player character's benefit. The system that makes the game function as a game is the same system that destroyed Yharnam as a city, and the player character is participating in it as fully as anyone. Chapter 2. The Great Ones and What They Actually Want. If you came into this video expecting the Great Ones to be simply incomprehensible eldritch horrors, with no discernible motive, I want to suggest that this reading, while understandable, misses something important. The Great Ones in Bloodborne are not random or chaotic. They have patterns. They have something that functions like intention, even if that intention operates at a scale that makes it look like madness from the human perspective. The first thing to understand is that the Great Ones are not a unified faction. They do not all want the same thing. They do not all have the same relationship to Yharnam or to humanity, and the evidence suggests they are not even all aware of each other in any meaningful sense. Ebrietas, the daughter of the Cosmos, is still in the cathedral ward because she was left behind when the other Great Ones departed, and she has apparently been waiting ever since. Her presence in the Healing Church's inner sanctum is not the church controlling her. She is there voluntarily, or as close to voluntarily as a Great One can be. She appears to be in a state of grief and waiting, still oriented toward a cosmos that has moved on without her. Murgo is an infant. This is easy to forget because Murgo is encountered as a final boss in the main game, and the entity that guards Murgo, the wet nurse, is one of the most terrifying enemies in the game. But Murgo is a child, the child of Yharnam the Pthumerian queen, who was impregnated by a Great One. The child was stillborn, or possibly born and then killed, and the soul of Murgo remains in the nightmare of Mensis, crying endlessly. The entire Mensis ritual was designed to make contact with Murgo, and the contact they achieved is what caused the mass madness of the school. Murgo did not do this intentionally. Murgo is a baby. The madness that came from contact was simply the result of what happens when a human mind gets close to a Great One's consciousness without any protective mediation. This is a pattern. The Great Ones in Bloodborne do not appear to go out of their way to harm humans. The harm that comes from them is largely a byproduct of the human desire to approach them. The scholars of Byrgenwerth and the Healing Church repeatedly tried to make contact, repeatedly tried to use Great One biology for human purposes, and each time the results were catastrophic, not because the Great Ones were hostile, but because the contact itself was more than human systems could handle. Rom, the vacuous spider, is perhaps the most unusual Great One in terms of her apparent function. She is encountered in Moonside Lake, a reflective space that seems to exist partially in the waking world and partially in the dream, and she is described as vacuous, meaning empty, which in the context of the game's language around insight and cognition suggests that she is, perhaps intentionally, a great one who has chosen not to think. She guards a secret. The nature of the secret is debated, but the most consistent reading is that she is maintaining a veil over the true nature of the sky above Yharnam, keeping the cosmic reality from being visible to ordinary people. When you kill her, the sky changes. The blood moon appears. Things that were previously hidden become visible. This suggests that Rom's vacuousness is not a deficiency, but a choice or a state of being that serves a specific function. She is a great one who has made herself unknowing in order to maintain a comfortable veil for the world below. Killing her removes that veil, which is necessary for the player character's progression, but also arguably catastrophic for anyone in Yharnam who is benefiting from the protection of not knowing. The blood moon is not simply a visual change, it is a shift in the nature of reality itself in Yharnam, and it produces immediate consequences in the form of changed enemy behaviors and new events throughout the city. The Celestial Emissary is a great one that is present in multiple forms throughout the game. The small celestial mob enemies, the blue tentacled creatures that appear in certain areas of the Healing Church, are early or diminished forms of the same entity that becomes the Celestial Emissary boss. The Church was cultivating these beings, studying them, possibly trying to use them as a bridge to other great ones. The fact that they appear in explicitly church-controlled spaces suggests that this cultivation was deliberate and sanctioned at the highest levels of the institution. Amygdala is the Great One most frequently encountered as a boss, appearing in multiple Chalice dungeons as well as in the Nightmare Frontier. Its arms appear throughout Yharnam in the main game, attached to buildings and architecture. The entity seems to be simultaneously present in multiple places, which suggests either that the visible arms belong to different individuals of the same type, or that Amygdala, as a Great One, is not bound to a single location in the way that physical creatures are. There is some evidence for the latter reading in the way the arms behave differently depending on where they appear. The ones in the main city are passive. The ones in the Nightmare Frontier are actively hostile. The Nightmare Frontier itself is worth examining as a location. It is a place where hunters who were lured there or became trapped there exist in a state of semi-permanent nightmare. The enemies throughout the space are hunters who have been there long enough to have gone feral or to have been transformed by whatever makes the Nightmare Frontier different from the hunter's dream. The presence of Amygdala, as the boss suggests that this nightmare space is either owned by or associated with that particular Great One, which raises the question of why Amygdala would maintain such a space and what purpose it serves. One reading I find compelling is that the nightmares in Bloodborne are not punishments or traps in the conventional sense. They are more like consequences. The Nightmare Frontier exists because hunters who went searching for certain things and found them became trapped in the reality adjacent to those things. The nightmare is the space that forms around sustained human exposure to Great One consciousness, and Amygdala presides over it the same way that an ocean presides over whatever sinks to its floor. Not deliberately, not maliciously, just as a function of what it is. Kin enemies in Bloodborne are humans or formerly human creatures that have been fundamentally altered by Great One influence, to the point where they are closer to Great Ones than to humans. The celestial mobs, the winter lanterns, the brain of Mensis, these are all entities that were once human and have been transformed through contact, research, or ritual into something in between. The winter lanterns are particularly disturbing because they wear their transformation openly in the form of a mass of eyes and brain matter exposed on their heads, and their attack causes rapid insight gain in the player character, which produces frenzy. This suggests that they are effectively transmitters of Great One consciousness, being so saturated with cosmic insight that proximity to them pushes other minds toward the same saturation at a rate the mind cannot survive. The brain of Mensis is the end point of what the school of Mensis was trying to achieve. It is a massive brain, a human brain, that has been cultivated and expanded and exposed to such sustained Great One influence that it has become something that straddles the boundary between human and Great One. Looking at it causes rapid insight accumulation. It is in some sense a thought made physical, the apotheosis of what happens when a human mind chases Great One consciousness without limit. The fact that it drops when killed provides one of the game's most powerful items, suggesting that even in this state, it retains something valuable, something of what it was before the transformation consumed it. The relationship between insight and madness in Bloodborne is one of the game's most sophisticated lore mechanisms. Insight is not simply knowledge or perception, it is a measure of how much exposure to Great One consciousness a given mind has accumulated, and it has a cost. Too much insight changes behavior, enemies become harder, new entities become visible. The world itself looks different. At extreme levels, the player character begins to experience effects that suggest their perception of reality is fundamentally altered. But the game also makes clear that zero insight is not safety. The city of Yharnam's ordinary citizens, the ones who lived their lives without ever looking too closely at what the church was doing, were transformed into beasts en masse, not because they sought insight, but because the old blood in their systems was doing something to them that the accumulation of insight might actually have provided some resistance to. There is a reading in which insight, painful and destabilizing as it is also the only thing that allows a hunter to maintain enough cognitive stability to function in the face of what Yharnam has become. Gehrman understood this in a way that most of his successors did not. He built the Hunter's Workshop as a place where hunters could return and recover not just physically, but mentally, a space insulated from the worst of the insight pressure that the real Yharnam exerted. The dream's safety comes at the cost of being bound to the moon presence, but the alternative, operating in Yharnam without any refuge, produces exactly the kind of breakdown that you see in the feral hunters throughout the game who have been there too long without returning to the dream. The moon presence itself is the most powerful and least visible Great One in Bloodborne's main narrative. It appears only at the end of 2 of the game's 3 endings, and in those appearances it is hostile and overwhelming. But for most of the game it operates entirely through intermediaries. Gehrman, the hunter's dream, the contract the player character entered before the game began. It is a management entity, something that organizes and controls the hunt at a macro level without ever directly intervening in its moment-to-moment events. This makes it more unsettling, not less. A Great One that directly attacks you is something you can at least fight. A Great One that has arranged the entire structure of your existence so that you never have occasion to fight it until the very end is something else. The 3 umbilical cords and the true ending they unlock suggest that the moon presence can be transcended. Consuming 3 pieces of the umbilical cord of a Great One's offspring floods the player character's system with enough Great One influence that when the moon presence attempts to feed on them at the end of the game, it cannot do so. The player character's mind has become, at that point, something the moon presence cannot digest. And the result is the transformation of the player character into a Great One, or at least a larval form of one. This ending is simultaneously triumphant and devastating, because it implies that the only way out of the system the moon presence built is to become something that is no longer within the system. The player character does not destroy the moon presence. They do not free Yharnam. They simply escape the cycle by ascending above it. Whatever happens to Yharnam after that ending is not addressed, because from the perspective of a Great One, what happens to Yharnam is no longer relevant in the way it was. Formless Eden is one of the most interesting Great Ones, precisely because he has no physical presence. He exists in blood and in the sound of breathing. He is diffuse, pervasive, present in every person in Yharnam who has ever received blood ministration. His lack of form suggests a different mode of Great One existence from entities like Ebrietas or Amygdala, who are present as discrete physical entities in specific locations. Odon is present everywhere the old blood has travelled, which is to say, everywhere in Yharnam and its history. The church's choir, The most research-focused faction within the Healing Church was working specifically toward establishing communication with Ebrietas after she was found abandoned in the Pthumerian labyrinth. What they found was a great one who was willing, or at least not unwilling, to interact with them. The item descriptions associated with the choir suggest that the interactions they achieved produced genuine advances in their understanding of Great One cognition. They also suggest that each advance brought them closer to the same fate that eventually consumed the School of Mensis: total exposure to something the human mind cannot contain. The choir's experiments in the orphanage involve selecting children with what the item descriptions call arcane potential, a term that suggests some human individuals have a biological relationship to Great One cognition that is different from the baseline. What this relationship consists of biologically is not explained, but the choir apparently believed that it could be cultivated and that the children who possessed it could be developed into something that could survive direct contact with a Great One. The fact that the orphanage's children are not present in the game as grown adults either means the experiment failed entirely or means the successful subjects are visible in some other form. The most compelling reading of what happened to the successful orphanage subjects points toward the celestial emissary. The boss form of this Great One is described in ways that suggest a transition from human to kin, and the location of the encounter inside the upper cathedral ward, above the orphanage, suggests a spatial and narrative connection between the two. The celestial emissary may be what the choir was trying to produce: a human being so thoroughly transformed by sustained Great One contact that they became a bridge between the two modes of existence. Whether this represents success or failure depends on what you think the goal should have been. Dark beasts are a distinct category of beast enemy in Bloodborne, defined by the electrical energy they emit and their visually different form from the standard beast types. The Pal Dark Beast, encountered in the Forbidden Woods jail section, and the Lauren Dark Beast in the Chalice dungeons, are both described in ways that suggest they represent an older or more advanced form of beast transformation, one that has gone further from the human starting point than the standard beasts of Yharnam's streets. The electrical energy they channel appears related to the lightning used by certain arcane-focused enemies, which suggests a connection to Great One biology that the ordinary beast transformation does not produce. The connection between electricity and Great One biology is one of the more subtle technical details in the game's lore. Several items associated with the Great Ones and with advanced arcane research produce or interact with electrical energy. The implication is that electrical discharge is a byproduct or a marker of certain types of Great One influence on biological systems, a visible expression of the kind of energy that exists at the intersection of physical matter and Great One cognition. Dark beasts have been transformed far enough that their bodies are producing this energy continuously, which places them at a point on the transformation spectrum that is qualitatively different from ordinary beast transformation. The watchdog of the Old Lords is a Chalice dungeon boss that represents the Pthumerian military at full strength, animated by the same old blood energies that sustain the undead giants. Its fire-based attacks and its sheer scale suggest that the Watchers of the Pthumerian labyrinth had access to offensive applications of old blood energy that the Healing Church's hunters never fully replicated. The Church's hunters relied on blood-enhanced physical ability and arcane tools. The Pthumerian military appears to have incorporated old blood energy directly into the combat capabilities of its elite units, producing creatures that were more weapon than warrior. The Great One cold blood items, found throughout the game, and particularly in the Chalice dungeons, are described as congealed remnants of Great One thought or memory, and they function as a source of blood echoes, the currency of the game's leveling system. This creates an interesting connection between Great One cognition and the player character's own development. Every level gained from Great One Cold Blood is a level built on condensed Great One thought. The player character's increasing power is literally constructed from the remnants of beings that operated at a scale the game's entire narrative is about. The lore is always doing double work in Bloodborne. Every mechanical system has a lore implication. Chapter 3: The Healing Church's Hidden History. The Healing Church presents itself to the people of Yharnam as an institution of healing, spiritual guidance, and protection. The reality is that it is an institution built on secrets, sustained by deliberate misdirection, and organized specifically to prevent its congregation from understanding what the blood administration was actually doing to them. This is not a new observation about Bloodborne, but the depth of that deception and the specific mechanisms the church used to maintain it is something that most analyses only partially address. Lawrence was the founder of the Healing Church, the student of Master Willem, who took the old blood and built a religion around it. His skull is one of the items the player character can find in the game, and it is described in a way that indicates Lawrence knew, from the beginning, that the blood would eventually transform those who used it. He chose to proceed anyway. The skull item description suggests he lamented his choice in retrospect, which implies he lived long enough to see some consequences of it, but the church continued after him and continued in the same direction. The structure of the church is hierarchical in a way that mirrors its management of information. At the bottom, the ordinary clergy and congregation who know the blood heals and accept it as divine grace. In the middle, the hunters and more senior clergy who know the blood comes from something dangerous and requires careful handling. At the top, the choir, who know the truth about the Great Ones and are actively conducting experiments to make contact with them. And, at the absolute apex, the individuals with direct knowledge of the moon presence's contract and the true purpose of the hunt. The choir occupies the upper floors of the Healing Church workshop and has access to ebriettas in the altar of despair. Their experiments, documented in several item descriptions and environmental details, were focused on achieving a genuine union with a Great One, rather than simply using Great One biology as a medical resource. They believed, based on their research, that such a union was possible and that it would represent the culmination of everything the church had been working toward. Lawrence's original vision, translated through generations of church scholarship, had become something like a project to manufacture contact with a god. The failure of this project is visible in the Orphan of Kos connection. The choir's research drew on the same parasites and biological material that were harvested from the fishing hamlet. The presence of celestial mobs in church spaces suggests that the cultivation of kin entities was part of this program, and the deterioration of church hunters into beasts, visible in the feral church hunters throughout the game, suggests that the choir's experiments, with more concentrated exposure to Great One biology, were producing the same outcome that the ordinary blood administration produced in the general population, just faster and more dramatically. Simon the Harrowed, encountered in the Old Hunters DLC, provides some of the clearest testimony about what it was like to be a hunter who understood what the church was doing without having the power to stop it. He is in the nightmare because he was pursuing the truth about what the church did at the fishing hamlet, and he arrived too late to change anything. His presence in the nightmare is a kind of consequence for knowing too much and acting too late. But unlike many of the other hunters in the nightmare, he retains his clarity and his bitterness. He is a witness who cannot leave and cannot forget and cannot make what he knows matter. The internal church politics that produced the fishing hamlet massacre are implied rather than stated directly. The decision to send hunters to the hamlet and take what was there was made by someone with enough authority in the early church to organize a significant operation. The fact that the fishing hamlet's inhabitants were not beasts, not hostile at first encounter, based on the evidence available, and not posing a threat to Yharnam, suggests that the justification for the massacre was not self-defense or plague prevention, it was resource acquisition. The choir, or whoever authorized the operation, wanted what the hamlet had, and did not consider the ethical weight of taking it by force. This is consistent with everything else we know about how the church operated. The residents of Old Yharnam were burned not because they were an unmanageable threat, but because they were evidence of a failed experiment that the church needed to conceal. The hunters who were sent to cull the population of hunters gone mad were not primarily motivated by mercy towards those hunters, but by the need to prevent the existence of mad hunters from becoming public knowledge. Every act of institutional violence in Bloodborne's history can be traced back to the church protecting itself, rather than the people it claimed to serve. Alfred is the character who most visibly embodies the internal contradiction of being a devoted church servant who also has genuine values. He is a hunter of the church's executioners, a faction originally associated with Ligarius, and the mission to imprison Annalise. He is sincere, enthusiastic, and genuinely believes in what he is doing. And then, if you give him the unopened summons, he massacres the vile bloods and loses himself entirely in the act, becoming something hollow. The game does not present this as a corruption. It presents it as a completion. Alfred's devotion was always oriented toward violence. The church gave it a target and a justification. When that violence was fully expressed, there was nothing left underneath it. Ligarius himself is a tragic figure in a different way. He was sent to imprison Annalise and her vile bloods, and he remained at the castle so long, maintaining the seal with his own power, that he became something distorted. His boss form in Cainhurst Castle shows a man who has pushed his own transformation far past any normal limit, using arcane and blood magic in ways that suggest he is no longer operating within the frameworks the church originally gave him. He built his own theology on top of the church's, and has been sustaining it alone for years. When the player character kills him, the mask he wore as a seal over Annalise's chamber falls away and reveals someone who, whatever he was when he started, has ended as something barely recognizable. The vile bloods are the church's most useful enemy and their most interesting mirror. Annalise and her court at Cainhurst represent an alternative lineage of old blood, one that does not come through the Healing Church's distribution system, but through a direct inheritance from the Puthumerians via Cainhurst's royal line. The church calls their blood impure and has declared them enemies of the hunt. The actual reason for this enmity is more likely that the vile bloods represent a source of old blood that the church cannot control, a competing lineage that undermines the church's monopoly on the blood. The Rune Workshop tool and the hunter runes it allows the player character to inscribe are another window into the church's hidden depths. The runes are described as words of the Great Ones, transcribed by Carol, a student of Byrgenwerth, into a form that human hunters can use and that has tangible effects on their capabilities. The existence of these runes indicates that at some point in the church's history, someone had enough contact with Great One communication to transcribe it, and that the church then incorporated those transcriptions into the hunter program as practical tools. The moon rune, in particular, is deeply interesting. It is associated with the moon presence and with the kind of development that comes from being deeply embedded in the hunter's dream. Players who use it accumulate blood echoes more rapidly, which in gameplay terms makes hunting more efficient, and in lore terms suggests that the moon presence benefits from, or at minimum is aligned with, the accumulation of experience through the hunt. This is consistent with the reading that the hunt is a project of some kind, but it also suggests that the relationship between hunters and the moon presence is genuinely reciprocal. The moon presence provides something back. The research hall, in the old Hunters DLC, is the Healing Church's most explicitly documented experimental facility, and it gives us the clearest picture of what the church was doing to real people in pursuit of its goals. The patients in the research hall were people who came to the church for healing, and were instead enrolled in experiments involving prolonged exposure to concentrated old blood, with the goal of producing controlled transformation rather than disease transformation. The results are visible in the enemies throughout the hall, human beings in various stages of incomplete or failed transformation, some still technically alive, some beyond what that term meaningfully describes. Adeline is the patient who gets the furthest in the research hall's program, and her arc is one of the most quietly powerful in the DLC. She asks repeatedly for brain fluid, which is her way of describing the concentrated insight accumulated by the transformed patients. What she is seeking is a direct experience of the cosmos, and she gets it. Her final dialogue, describing what she sees, is one of the few moments in Bloodborne where a character who sought Great One contact describes the experience positively without immediately following that positivity with catastrophic breakdown. Whether this means she succeeded where others failed or simply failed differently is left ambiguous. The living failures in the research hall are the patients who did not reach Adeline's outcome. They are gathered in a garden at the top of the hall, transformed into luminous humanoids that emit arcane energy, no longer functional as the people they were, but also not yet arrived at whatever the transformation was pushing them toward. They are stuck in the middle, which, in Bloodborne, is always the worst place to be. The garden itself is a grotesque pastoral scene, a research facility's back area turned into a holding space for human beings who have become something the church cannot use and will not release. The connection between the research hall and the astral clock tower, where Lady Maria is encountered as a boss, is significant. Maria's presence above the hall suggests she was connected to the research conducted there, either as a supervisor, a participant, or a guardian of the operation. The fact that she throws her weapon into a well before the DLC's events, presumably in response to what she witnessed or participated in, places the research hall's timeline before her withdrawal from hunting. She was there. She saw what was done. And she chose to stop in a context where stopping required removing herself from the hunt entirely. The church's tool enemies, the servants and clergy encountered throughout the main game and in the DLC, represent the institutional lower ranks, people who joined the church for the ordinary reasons people join institutions: security, purpose, community, access to the blood's healing. Most of them are transformed by the night of the hunt into either beasts or hostile survivors. The ones who remain human and hostile are defending spaces and resources that the night of the hunt has made suddenly contestable, fighting for a church that exists only in their own minds at this point. The institutional authority they served has collapsed. What they are defending now is habit, the blood-vile economy of Yharnam, the network of production and distribution that sustained the population's ongoing blood ministration, is implied to have been enormous. The sheer number of blood vials available throughout the game, in every corner of Yharnam, suggests a supply chain that was deeply embedded in the city's infrastructure. Where exactly the blood came from, at the scale required to supply an entire city, is one of the questions the game raises, without fully answering, but the various hints in item descriptions and environmental storytelling point toward the Chalice dungeon system as the primary source for the most potent blood, with the population itself as a secondary source through a collection and processing system. The church's choir hymns are referenced in several item descriptions as a specific type of arcane attack used by choir members. The ability to use music as a literal weapon in the Bloodborne universe suggests that the choir's communication with Ebrietas and with other great ones produced practical applications that went beyond healing and transformation. The use of sound as a medium of Great One communication, seen also in the way certain enemy attacks involve sounds that produce insight effects, points toward a layer of Great One interaction that operates through sensory channels rather than physical or biological ones. The world of Bloodborne suggests that Great One consciousness can be communicated and transmitted through multiple pathways, and the choir was trying to master as many of them as possible. The connection between the Healing Church and Cainhurst is one of the most politically interesting relationships in the game's history. Cainhurst predates the church, and its blood lineage, the vile blood inheritance from the Pthumerians through their royal line, represents a form of old blood use that developed independently of both Byrgenwerth's scholarly tradition and the church's institutional one. The church's decision to send Ligarius and the executioners to deal with Cainhurst was therefore not simply a heresy prosecution. It was the elimination of a competing power with a competing claim to old blood legitimacy. Annalise survives. She is immortal, sustained by her vile blood heritage, and her persistence throughout the game's timeline, sitting in her throne in a castle whose court has been entirely killed, is a statement about the resilience of the things the church tried to erase. She cannot die. The church's executioners killed everything around her and could not touch her. She sits and waits and accepts the blood dregs offered by hunters who have pledged to her covenant, accumulating strength for a restoration of the Cainhurst line that may never come. She is the longest-running victim and survivor of the church's political violence, and the game never addresses her final fate. The executioners, as a faction, represent the most openly violent arm of the church's institutional agenda. the people specifically tasked with eliminating threats to the church's monopoly on the blood and on the hunt. Their armor design, all gilded surfaces and imposing bulk, suggests an institution that wanted its violence to look authoritative and sanctioned rather than pragmatic. They were not assassins operating in secret, they were an official response force. The church's formal declaration that it had the right to use lethal force against anyone it designated as a threat to the blood. The sword hunter badge, associated with the church hunters of the mainline church, unlocks access to a specific set of weapons and equipment that represents the church's aesthetic and tactical philosophy. Church weapons tend toward longer reach and more formal design than the early hunter weapons, reflecting an institution that had moved from emergency response to formal military structure. The church hunter is not a scrappy monster slayer in improvised gear. The church hunter is an official of an institution, operating with institutional backing and institutional weapons, in service of institutional goals. The Hunter's Oath badge, associated with the old Hunter faction in the DLC, unlocks equipment associated with Gehrman's generation, the original tools of the trade before the church fully institutionalized the hunt. These weapons are rawer, more improvised, designed for someone who did not have institutional backing and had to make do with what was available. The contrast between old hunter equipment and church equipment is a capsule history of how the hunt changed over time, from a necessary response to a situation to a formal institution with its own politics, hierarchies, and corruption. The choir set found in the orphanage area is some of the most visually interesting equipment in the game, combining elements of religious garb with what appears to be arcane research equipment. The long white coats suggest scientific function. The hoods and the symbolic elements suggest religious context. The combination points to an institution that genuinely believed its research and its faith were the same thing, that studying the great ones was a form of devotion rather than a form of exploitation. The sincerity of this belief does not change the outcomes of the research, but it is important for understanding why the church did what it did, rather than simply cataloguing what it did. Ebrietas herself is the figure who most clearly embodies the complexity of the choir's relationship with the Great Ones. She is a Great One who was found abandoned and who chose to remain in contact with the humans who found her. Her attacks are violent when the player character enters her space, but the item description for the prayer set found near her altar suggests that she has participated in some form of reciprocal relationship with the choir, receiving their prayers and responding to them in ways that produced results. She is the only Great One in the game who appears to have an ongoing communicative relationship with human beings that produce something other than catastrophe, at least for a significant period. Chapter 4: What really happened in the Chalice Dungeons. The Chalice Dungeon system in Bloodborne is the game's most misunderstood piece of content. Players who engage with it tend to describe it as a gameplay system, procedurally generated dungeon content that provides a separate and optional path for gear progression. And mechanically, that is accurate, but lore-wise, the Chalice Dungeons are the most important places in Bloodborne, the locations where the oldest layers of the game's history are preserved, and the content within them constitutes a substantial portion of the game's deepest narrative. The chalices themselves are vessels, literally and figuratively. Physically, they are ritualistic objects used by Thumerian priests to access the labyrinth. Lore-wise, they are containers for the history of a civilization that predates everything else in the game. When the player character creates a chalice dungeon, they are not generating a new space. They are accessing a space that already exists, one that has been sealed and preserved in a state that reflects what it was at a specific moment in Pthumerian history. The ritual that creates the dungeon opens a door rather than builds a room. The Pthumerian architecture in the Chalice Dungeons is distinct from everything else in Bloodborne. It is older, more monumental, and built around a different aesthetic principle, where Yharnam's surface architecture is Gothic and ornate, and organized around a visible civic function. The Pthumerian architecture is about depth and descent. Huge vertical shafts, long corridors that lead toward the center of the labyrinth rather than toward an open sky. The aesthetic is designed to communicate that these spaces were built by people whose fundamental orientation was downward, toward whatever waited in the deepest chambers. The Watchers in the Chalice dungeons are among the most interesting enemy types in the game from a lore perspective. They are described as belonging to a specific caste of Pthumerian society, guards and enforcers who maintain the security of the labyrinth and its contents. The item descriptions for Pthumerian weapons and armor indicate that the Watchers were an elite military caste, not unlike the church hunters in function, but operating in service of the Pthumerian queens rather than a religious institution. The parallel between Watcher and Hunter is deliberate. It is another instance of the game pointing toward the way that Yharnam's surface civilization is essentially repeating the patterns of the civilization beneath it, without knowing it. The Pthumerian queens are the most powerful and most enigmatic entities in the Chalice dungeons. There appear to be multiple queens across the different depths of the labyrinth, which suggests either that the Pthumerian civilization had multiple queens simultaneously, or that the title of queen was passed down and the ritual spaces of earlier queens were preserved even as new ones took the role. The deepest queen, encountered in the Hill Root Chalice, in the very deepest accessible layer of the labyrinth, is one of the most powerful bosses in the game and one of the most visually striking. She appears fully transformed by her communion with the Great Ones, something in between human and Great One, her attacks involving arcane energies associated exclusively with direct Great One contact. The pregnancy of the Pthumerian queen, specifically the fact that Murgo was her child, is documented in the Chalice dungeon lore. The ritual space in which she apparently underwent the communion that produced her pregnancy is present in the dungeons, and the item description for the Pthumerian elder's staff references the role of the royal bloodline in maintaining contact with the Great Ones across generations. The queens were not simply rulers of a political state. They were the living conduit between Pthumerian civilization and the Great Ones, and the maintenance of that conduit was the primary purpose of the entire political and social structure built around them. The bloodletting beast in the Chalice dungeons is a creature that appears to be a human or formerly human being that has undergone a version of the beast's scourge, but at a scale and intensity that the surface-level beast enemies in Yharnam do not approach. It is massive. Its body has been modified with surgical instruments embedded in its skull, which suggests it was not a natural transformation, but a deliberate one, an experiment conducted in the depths of the labyrinth to produce something specific. What that something was intended to be is unclear, but the implication seems to be a controlled version of the beast transformation, something powerful enough to serve as a weapon or a guardian, but directed rather than feral. The living failures in the main game, encountered in the research hall, and the celestial mob enemies throughout church spaces represent the surface iteration of what was being attempted in the Chalice dungeons, with less sophisticated methods. The church had access to Pthumerian research, filtered through Byrgenwerth's scholarship, and was attempting to replicate outcomes that the Pthumerians had achieved through generations of deliberate cultivation. The rate of failure, visible in the number of transformed or failed experiments throughout church spaces, indicates that the church was pushing faster than the underlying biology could support. The Pthumerian descendant is one of the more unusual boss encounters in the Chalice dungeons. It fights with a serrated weapon and moves with an agility that is unusual for an enemy that appears to be an ordinary humanoid, and its item drops suggest it belongs to a lineage of Pthumerian bloodline, rather than the Watcher military caste. It is possibly a member of the royal family in a diminished form, a descendant of queens who lost or never had access to the full extent of their ancestors' communion with the Great Ones. The encounter feels elegiac in a way that many Chalice bosses do not, a remnant of something that was once much more powerful, fighting with the skills it inherited, but without the backing that made those skills meaningful. The Undead Giant is an enemy that appears in multiple Chalice dungeon configurations, always as a guardian of certain chambers. Its description and appearance suggest it is a former Pthumerian warrior who has been sustained far past a natural lifespan through exposure to the old blood in the labyrinth environment. This is one of the clearest demonstrations that the old blood's life-extending properties were known and used in Pthumerian civilization, probably as a deliberate tool of the priesthood and the military caste to maintain veteran warriors. The cost of that extension is visible in what the undead giants have become: enormous, durable, but reduced to an instinctual aggressive state with no apparent cognitive function remaining. The defiled chalice and fetid offering system is mechanically about creating harder dungeon configurations, but lore-wise suggests something more interesting. The offerings that corrupt or defile a chalice are described in terms that indicate they alter the ritual space's connection to the deeper realities the chalice accesses. A fetid offering calls something from further away, something older. A defiled offering degrades the space itself, making it more precarious, more dangerous. This suggests that the chalice ritual system has a range of possible settings, and that the default settings used by players represent a relatively controlled access point. The layer system within each chalice dungeon represents the geological layers of meaning in Bloodborne's history. Each layer is deeper, older, and more dangerous than the one above it. The entities guarding the deepest layers are the most powerful and the most transformed. The treasure at the deepest layer, the lamp at the bottom of the final boss room, represents the end point of a descent into the oldest and most concentrated version of what the labyrinth contains. Completing the deepest chalice dungeons and reaching Eye Hill is the closest the game lets you get to the absolute foundation of everything Yharnam was built on. The ailing Loran chalice dungeons introduce a different civilization story into the lore, one that is mostly absent from the surface content of the game. Loran was another city, another civilization that had contact with the Great Ones, and that used the Old Blood, and that eventually fell to the Beast Scourge in a way that Yharnam is in the process of repeating. The Loran dungeons are set in a desert environment, which suggests that the world of Bloodborne is larger than the single city of Yharnam, and that the patterns visible in Yharnam's history have occurred elsewhere, and will presumably occur elsewhere again. The Loran Dark Beast is the most direct evidence of the Loran civilization in the game. It is an enormous beast, different in form from the standard beast enemies of Yharnam, and its fighting style involves electrical energy that suggests either a different lineage of Great One influence or a different stage of transformation than the Yharnam Beast Scourge produces. The item descriptions associated with the Loran Chalice dungeons are fragmentary and sad. They describe a civilization that knew what was happening to it and could not stop it, that documented the progression of the Scourge with increasing desperation, and that ultimately fell completely. The network of Chalice dungeons is, in a sense, the game's archive. It preserves civilizations that fell, monsters that were made, experiments that failed, and queens who transcended. It is not a playful space or a reward system. It is a record of what happens when intelligence, ambition, and access to the Old Blood intersect across thousands of years, and it is deliberately harder and less narratively clear than the surface game, because the truths it contains are the oldest and hardest ones. The lower Pthumeru dungeon contains rooms that appear to be laboratories rather than temples or guard rooms, containing equipment and configurations that suggest active research rather than ritual practice. The Pthumerians were not simply religious custodians of the Great One's tombs, they were studying the contents of those tombs. The research conducted in the lower Pthumeru dungeons predates Byrgenwerth by what is presumably a significant period, and it produced some of the same outcomes: beings transformed by contact with Old Blood, experiments that exceeded their intended scope. The Pthumerian Elder Boss is the version of Pthumerian leadership most fully consumed by the demands of its role. It fights using arcane staves and fire, in combinations that suggest access to Old Blood applications that the surface game's enemies do not use, and its item drops provide some of the best evidence for the Pthumerian practice of sustained life extension through Old Blood exposure. The Elder has clearly been in the labyrinth for an extremely long time. It is a figure of authority reduced to a last defense, the final administrative layer of a civilization that collapsed in all the ways that matter long ago. The sinister chalice system, which allows players to invade each other's dungeons, introduces a multiplayer dimension with an interesting lore implication. The sinister bell resonance that enables invasions is described in terms that suggest it calls hunters from other worlds, other versions of the dreaming space, into your ritual space. In lore terms, this suggests that the Chalice dungeon reality is permeable in a way that the waking world is not, that the ritual spaces exist in a layer of reality where the distinction between individual dreamers is blurry. The presence of bell-ringing women throughout the Chalice dungeons as enemies that summon additional hostile hunters is consistent with this reading, presenting the Chalice space as a place where the boundaries between individual hunts are thin. These women are performing a version of the same ritual that the School of Mensis used to summon hunters into the nightmare, and the fact that it works in the Chalice dungeons as well suggests that the labyrinth exists in a part of reality that is naturally porous in this way. The cursed Pthumeru Hill Chalice, the deepest and most challenging Chalice dungeon configuration, contains enemies and bosses at power levels that substantially exceed anything in the main game. This scaling is not simply a gameplay challenge escalation. It represents the depth of the Pthumerian labyrinth, where the things that rested closest to the tombs of the Great Ones were exposed to the most concentrated Great One influence for the longest time. The deepest creatures of the labyrinth are simply the most transformed, the furthest from whatever they originally were, the most saturated with something that does not translate cleanly into human biology or cognition. The presence of the Yharnam Pthumerian Queen in the deepest Chalice dungeon is the capstone of the entire system's narrative logic. She is at the bottom. She is the reason the labyrinth exists. She is what happened when the communion the Pthumians sought actually worked. Reaching her requires completing the entire chain of Chalice dungeons, descending through every layer of preserved history, passing through every guardian and every experiment, and every failure. And when you get there, what you find is a woman in the final stage of transformation into something that is not quite human and not quite Great One, still accessible, still able to be fought, still carrying the weight of everything that her civilization's choices produced. The Chalice items themselves are some of the most mechanically and lore-wise interesting collectibles in the game. Each one represents a different tier of access, a different depth of the labyrinth, and a different set of Pthumerian experiments and guardians. The cursed Pthumeru Ihil Chalice requires the most preparation to use and provides access to the most dangerous content. The fact that the player character can use these items at all, can perform the rituals, can access the labyrinth as a living hunter, is itself a lore-wise interesting detail. The rituals require specific materials, specific preparations, specific knowledge. The player character has all of this, which suggests either that the knowledge is widely available in Yharnam, or that the player character's particular circumstances give them access to things that most hunters would not have. The old Pthumeru Labyrinth Chalice is the entry point to the system, and it is presented as something that Gehrman's generation of hunters used to access the labyrinth in the early period of the hunt. This positions the Chalice dungeon system as one of the original tools of the first hunters, part of the same generation of practices that produced the hunter's dream and the workshop. The early hunters were going into the labyrinth. They were encountering the Pthumerians and their guardians and their queens. They were collecting what they found and bringing it back to Byrgenwerth and the early church. The Chalice dungeon system is the formalized, ritualized version of what those early expeditions became. The gems and blood gems found throughout the Chalice dungeons represent the most concentrated physical expressions of old blood properties available in the game. Specific gem configurations can fundamentally alter a weapon's properties, pushing it toward cold, fire, arcane, or other elemental properties associated with different aspects of Great One influence. The most powerful of these gems are found only in the deepest Chalice dungeons, which is consistent with the logic that the deepest areas of the labyrinth are where the most intense Great One influence has been concentrated for the longest time. The gems are essentially fossilized Great One biology, crystallized applications of the same forces that produced the Beast Scourge and the Kin transformations, but stabilized into a form that a weapon can carry. Chapter 5. Gehrman, the First Hunter, and What He Lost. Almost everything about Gehrman is a secret in Bloodborne. He is present from the beginning of the game, accessible in the hunter's dream as a source of information and resources. and his role as the keeper of the dream means that players interact with him repeatedly throughout their playthroughs. But the full weight of what Gehrman is and what happened to him accumulates only gradually, and the ending of his questline, in which he begs the player character to end his existence and free him from the dream, lands differently once you understand the context. Gehrman was the first hunter of the new generation, the man who built the hunter's workshop and codified the fighting techniques that all subsequent hunters inherited. He trained the hunters that trained the hunters that trained the hunters of the current era. The saw, cleaver, and hunter axe that are presented to the player character at the beginning of the game as starting weapons were designed by or for Gehrman's generation of hunters. The entire material culture of the hunt, as it exists in the game's timeline, is descended from what Gehrman built. But before Gehrman was the first hunter, he was a person. And the most important fact about Gehrman the person is that he trained Lady Maria, and that he lost her in the fishing hamlet nightmare, and that this loss is what created the gap in him that the moon presence filled with the contract that became the hunter's dream. The dream is not simply a management tool. It is a substitution. The moon presence offered Gehrman a dream in place of the reality that had become unbearable, and Gehrman accepted. The doll that Gehrman created and placed in the dream is the most visible evidence of this substitution. It is crafted in Maria's exact image. It speaks with a gentle, somewhat vacant affect that suggests it is approximating a personality without having one. It provides healing and upgrades to the player character in a role that mirrors what a living companion might provide to a hunter. Gehrman built this replica of the person he lost, and then placed himself in a garden next to it, and has been living in that arrangement for what is implied to be an extremely long time. The tragedy is not simply that he lost Maria, it is that the dream is a perfect loop. Gehrman cannot age in the dream. He cannot forget in the dream. The grief he carries does not soften over time, because time does not function normally in the dream. He has been in precisely the grief of Maria's death, maintained at that exact pitch, for the entirety of the dream's existence. The moon presence's contract trapped him not in a torture chamber, but in a perfectly comfortable simulacrum of his life, before the loss, with one element permanently missing and permanently missed. Maria's own history, as the game reveals it, adds layers to this. She was from the Cainhurst line, which means she was of the vile blood lineage that the church officially condemned. Gehrman trained her anyway, or she came to him already trained, and she became his finest student. The fact that she was vile blood would have made her relationship with the church complicated at best, and the fact that Gehrman trained her suggests he either did not know or did not care about the church's politics to that degree. His interest was in hunting, not in the institutional games played around it. She went to the fishing hamlet. She witnessed or participated in what happened there. She came back changed, discarded her weapon, declined to hunt further, and eventually died. The manner of her death is not stated directly, but the implication of the item descriptions and her presence in the hunter's nightmare as a guardian suggests that she took her own life as a response to the weight of what she had been part of. The game handles this with more delicacy than it handles most of its violence. Her death was not a casualty of the hunt in the ordinary sense. It was a moral conclusion. Gehrman's subsequent creation of the doll and his acceptance of the moon presence's contract reads, in this light, as a man who could not accept the conclusion she reached and built an alternative. He could not end the hunt as she did. He was too embedded in it, too responsible for what it had become. So he built a dream and stayed in it and watched hunters come and go and tried to give them a mercy, the offer at the end of each journey, to simply end it, that he could not give himself. The doll's consciousness is one of the game's genuinely unresolved mysteries. She occasionally speaks in ways that suggest a level of awareness beyond what a simple construct would have. She asks the player character, at certain points, whether Gehrman seems well, whether he is happy, in a way that implies she can observe him, but cannot interpret what she observes. She is concerned about him without being able to understand the nature of what she is witnessing. This creates a dynamic where a replica of a dead person is worrying about the person who made the replica, without understanding either fact about herself. The player character's relationship with Gehrman is structurally different in the third ending from any other endpoint in the game. To obtain the true ending, the player character must consume 3/3 of umbilical cord items before fighting the moon presence, and then succeed against it. Gehrman, in this ending, does not offer his usual mercy. He watches the player character transform and is left behind in the dream. The doll holds the tiny squirming thing that the player character has become, and Gehrman watches, and the game implies that he understands what has happened, and that it is what the hunt was always working toward even if he did not know it. Whether this is a liberation for Gehrman or another form of imprisonment is something the game does not answer. He is still in the dream. The moon presence is dead. The dream may be stable or may be unraveling. The doll is still there, but the purpose the dream was built to serve has either been fulfilled or made irrelevant, and a man who has organized his entire existence around a purpose that has just been transformed is not necessarily in a better position than he was before. The hunter tools and techniques that Gehrman developed and transmitted through his workshop are a legacy that outlasted him in the sense that they continued after his practical involvement in the hunt ended. The burial blade, his personal weapon, is obtainable by the player character after defeating him, and is one of the most technically demanding weapons in the game to use effectively. Its curved blade and the quick-step strategy it rewards are Gehrman's own innovation, developed by someone who spent enough time hunting to understand where conventional weapons fell short. The old hunters, who appear throughout the hunter's nightmare, are the remnant of the generation that Gehrman directly or indirectly trained. Most of them are hostile to the player character in the nightmare, which raises the question of whether they are aware of the player character as a fellow hunter, or simply responding to everything in the nightmare as a threat. Some of them have specific names and histories visible through item descriptions. Most of them have been in the nightmare long enough to have lost the clarity that distinguished hunters from beasts in the waking world. The presence of the first hunter's equipment throughout the nightmare, their weapons and armor preserved and still functional, is one of the ways the nightmare functions as a museum of the hunt's history. Everything that was done in the early period of Yharnam's modern history is preserved here in the form of the people who did it, frozen in the moment of their worst actions and forced to repeat those actions. It is not a space of redemption, it is a space of consequence. The old workshop, accessed through a hidden path in the hunter's dream, is a decrepit version of the main workshop space. It is where the early work of defining the hunter's identity took place. The presence of Gehrman's belongings in the old workshop, including dolls and sewing materials that connect to the doll in the main workshop, suggests that the old workshop predates the cleaner version the player character normally uses and represents the original space before it was formalized into the dream's current configuration. The communion rune, associated with the moon presence, increases the maximum number of blood vials the player character can carry. This is practical in gameplay terms, but in lore terms it is interesting because it suggests the moon presence actively benefits from the hunter being able to sustain themselves longer in the field. A hunter who can carry more healing means a hunter who survives longer, which means a hunter who hunts more. The rune is not a gift from the moon presence out of generosity. It is an optimization for the moon presence's own purposes. Gehrman's acceptance of this arrangement, the creation of a dream that serves the moon presence's project in exchange for a simulacrum of a life that once had meaning, is the most melancholy decision in the game. He is not evil. He is not corrupted in the way that Mikolash or the choir's senior members are corrupted. He is a man who made a deal when he was most vulnerable and has been living inside that deal ever since, maintaining it with as much grace as he can manage, trying to ensure that the hunters who pass through the dream get something worth having, even if what they get is ultimately in service of something they cannot see. The parallels between Gehrman and Lawrence are interesting to map out. Both are founders of systems that they built in good faith and that the systems then consumed. Lawrence founded the Healing Church as a way to bring the blood's benefits to ordinary people and to advance the scholarly project of understanding the great ones. Gehrman built the hunter's dream as a refuge for hunters and a space outside the hunt's most destructive effects. Both men's creations outlasted them in forms that neither would have chosen. Both are, in some sense, haunting their own creations from positions of powerlessness. The difference is that Lawrence's failure is moral as well as practical. He knew the blood would transform people and chose to distribute it anyway. Gehrman's failure is primarily one of understanding. He made a contract with a great one without fully grasping what the contract would mean in perpetuity. Both failures are tragic, but they are different types of tragedy, and the game is careful to distinguish between them in the way it treats each character. The Gatling gun and similar heavy weaponry found in the DLC and throughout the game are associated with the hunters of the first generation, who appear to have been more willing to use heavy ordnance than the Church's later hunter cadres. This suggests that Gehrman's generation of hunters was operating in conditions where the conventional hunter toolkit was insufficient, where the beasts or other threats they encountered required overwhelming force rather than the precise intervention of later hunting styles. The shift from heavy weaponry to the Church's more refined hunting philosophy mirrors the shift from emergency response to managed institution. The Moon Presence's contract with Gehrman specifically, as opposed to a generic contract with whoever happened to be the first hunter, raises a question about why Gehrman was chosen. The most coherent reading is that Gehrman was not chosen arbitrarily. He was chosen because of his grief. A person who has lost something irreplaceable and who cannot accept that loss is someone who can be offered a substitute, a dream in place of reality, a doll in place of a person, an endless cycle in place of a life that ended. The Moon Presence did not offer Gehrman power or knowledge. It offered him a place to keep his grief, and he took it. The hunter who follows in Gehrman's footsteps in the second ending, taking his place as the new keeper of the dream, is offered the same deal without the same grief driving it, which raises the interesting question of why they would accept. The ending is presented as a choice, the player character choosing not to submit to Gehrman's mercy, and instead overcoming him and taking his place. It is, arguably, the most freely chosen of the three endings because it does not require the preparation of the true ending and does not involve simply giving up as the first ending does. It involves beating Gehrman and then accepting something that looks, from the outside, like what he had. Whether it is the same trap or a different situation is something the game leaves open. The grave of Lady Maria, marked in the hunter's dream, is present throughout the game as an environmental detail that most players will see without necessarily understanding. It is a grave for someone who died before the player character arrived in the dream. Gehrman tends it. The doll exists near it, the entire emotional center of the dream. The reason the dream is the specific kind of sad, overgrown, gentle space is that grave everything grew around the absence it marks. Chapter 6. The Nightmare Frontier and the Spaces Between. The nightmare spaces in Bloodborne are not simply boss arenas with atmospheric decoration. They are distinct ontological environments with their own rules, their own histories, and their own populations of entities that have been there long enough to have developed something like a local culture of consequence. Understanding these spaces and how they relate to each other and to the waking world of Yharnam is essential for understanding what the game is actually saying about the nature of reality. The hunter's dream is the most benign of the nightmare spaces and the most immediately familiar to the player character, because it is the space they return to after each death. It is also, as discussed, a space created specifically to serve a contract between Gehrman and the Moon Presence, which means it is a designed space rather than an emergent one. Its atmosphere of gentle decay, the overgrown garden, the workshop slowly being reclaimed by nature, the pale light that suggests neither full day nor full night, is consistent with a space that was created by grief and has been maintained by it ever since. The Nightmare Frontier is different in character. It is colder, more hostile, and less organized. The enemies within it are hunters who became trapped there, not through the kind of deliberate contract that Gehrman made, but through the more common mechanism of accumulating too much insight and spending too long in proximity to Great One influence. The Nightmare Frontier is a space that formed around the presence of amygdala, which means it is not a designed space, but an emergent one. A reality that coalesced around a Great One, and then began accumulating people who wandered too close. The lecture building, serves as a transitional space between the waking world and the nightmare spaces. It exists in a version of reality that is adjacent to both, accessible from certain points in Yharnam's geography and containing portals to both the Nightmare of Mensis and the Nightmare Frontier. The fact that it was originally a place of scholarship, a building associated with Byrgenwerth's educational mission, and is now a transitional space between realities, suggests something about the relationship between the pursuit of forbidden knowledge and the erosion of normal reality. The students within the lecture building, who have been transformed into spider-type enemies, are among the most philosophically interesting enemy configurations in the game. They are pursuing a form of existence that their original scholarship pointed toward, without being able to understand what that pursuit would cost. The spider form, associated with ROM and with the specific type of Great One cognition that functions as a veil, suggests that these students found exactly what they were looking for. They achieved a form of expanded perception. They just did not survive the achievement in any human sense. The Nightmare of Mensis is the most hostile and disorienting of the major nightmare spaces. It contains the school of Mensis in a distorted form, the Iron Fortress floating in a void above a landscape that does not obey ordinary spatial logic, and the brain of Mensis hanging in the darkness, radiating madness at everything in range. The scholars who are still present there, wearing their cages and mumbling, are people who made contact with a Great One and are now existing in the aftermath of that contact in a space that has been warped by it. The iron cage that the brain of Mensis is contained within, which can be lowered to remove its sight-based attack and then used to reveal a hidden area beneath the nightmare, is one of the most interesting environmental puzzles in the game from a lore perspective. Someone built that cage. Someone designed the mechanism that can lower it. This means that, at some point, someone in the school of Mensis anticipated that the brain would need to be contained and built a containment system in advance. This is evidence of extraordinary foresight, or evidence that the process of creating the brain was iterative, and the earlier attempts had created something similar that required containment. The hidden area beneath the lowered cage contains a winter lantern enemy guarding a path to the Mensis cage room, where the player character can find Yharnam, the Pthumerian queen in her current state. She sits catatonic in a chair, barely responsive, connected to Murgo through the still-living cord. Her state suggests she is in a sustained state of Great One contact, possibly the state she has been in since Murgo's stillbirth, maintained there by the Mensis ritual, whether or not she is aware of the ritual's purpose or her role in it. The staging of this encounter is the game communicating something through environmental design rather than dialogue. Yharnam the Queen was a real person, the deepest queen of the Pthumerian labyrinth, who underwent something that produced a child that died or was killed, and who has been in this state ever since, while a nightmare forms around the continued existence of that child's soul. She is not a villain in any meaningful sense. She is a woman who became a conduit for something beyond her control and has been in that state for longer than the history of Yharnam's surface civilization. The fishing hamlet nightmare, in the Old Hunters DLC, has a different character from the other nightmare spaces. It is brighter, more melancholy, and less immediately hostile in some of its areas. The hamlet itself is preserved in a state from the time of the massacre, with fishermen still present as enemies, but clearly not hostile in origin. The fishing hamlet priests and the shark giants are entities from the original hamlet that have been transformed by their long existence in the nightmare rather than by the same processes that created Yharnam's beasts. The body of Kos, on the shoreline, is one of the most visually arresting set pieces in the game. She is enormous, pale, clearly deceased, washed onto a beach that exists in a nightmare space, and therefore cannot be the physical location where she died. Her body is preserved in the nightmare, the same way that everything else in a nightmare is preserved, as a permanent record of a moment of violence or loss. The orphan of Kos emerges from her corpse, born into a nightmare from a dead mother, and the fight that follows is one of the most emotionally intense in the game because of what the player character is doing, killing a child who was born into grief and has never known anything else. The cursed fishing hamlet, the one that exists in the waking world and is accessible as an optional area in the DLC, is a ruined version of the hamlet after the massacre. The fishermen there are more hostile and further transformed than their nightmare counterparts, suggesting that the nightmare has been feeding back into the waking world through whatever connection was created by Kos's death. This bidirectional bleed between nightmare and waking is consistent with how other nightmare spaces in the game function. The item descriptions for the weapons and equipment associated with the fishing hamlet nightmare, and the early hunters provide some of the most explicit statements about what happened there. The rakuyo, Maria's weapon, is described in terms that confirm it was her personal weapon and that its disposal in a well in the hamlet was a deliberate act associated with her refusal to continue hunting. The fact that the weapon is still functional and findable by the player character is an interesting structural choice, suggesting that the world preserves evidence of these decisions even when the people who made them are gone. Simon the Harrowed, encountered in the Old Hunters DLC, provides some of the clearest testimony about what it was like to be a hunter who understood what the church was doing without having the power to stop it. He found the truth. He is reporting it. He cannot do anything with the report because the people who need to hear it are either dead or imprisoned in this nightmare. His role as a witness without an audience is one of the more quietly bleak things in a game full of quietly bleak things. The church pick is a weapon that connects the Old Hunters DLC back to the main game's church architecture, serving as a reminder that the hunters who ended up in the hunter's nightmare were not separate from the church. They were the church. The hunters trapped in the nightmare are the logical conclusion of what the church built, the people who carried out its worst decisions, and who are now held in a space shaped by the consequences of those decisions. The whirligig saw, one of the most mechanically unusual weapons in the DLC, is associated with hunters who specialized in fighting beasts at close range with maximum force. It suggests a generation of hunters that faced different problems from the hunters of the main game's timeline, things that required dedicated tools rather than general-purpose hunting weapons. The difference between old hunter weapon design and church hunter weapon design is a mechanical record of how the threats changed over time. The Nightmare of Mensis and the Fishing Hamlet Nightmare are spatially connected in an interesting way through the game's hidden geography. Both are accessible from the main game world through specific triggers, and both represent different aspects of the same fundamental problem. What happens when human beings try to engage with Great One consciousness and the engagement goes catastrophically wrong? Mensis is the institutional version, a whole school that failed simultaneously. The Fishing Hamlet is the moral version, a group of individuals who made specific choices that had specific consequences. The Ludwig's Rifle and its connection to the early Church Hunter program provides a link between the DLC's historical content and the main game's present. The design of church firearms evolved significantly between Ludwig's era and the game's current timeline, which implies that the challenges hunters faced also evolved. The early firearms were heavier, more powerful, less precise. The later church designs traded some of that raw power for adaptability and the ability to carry multiple weapon configurations. The evolution of the tools reflects the evolution of the threat and the institution that was managing it. The Kos Parasite. The weapon obtained from the Orphan of Kos is one of the most unusual items in the game in terms of what it represents. It is a piece of the biology of a dead Great One, fashioned into a weapon that channels the same arcane energies the Orphan used. Equipping it changes the player character visually in ways that suggest the item is not simply a weapon, but a biological integration. Using it connects the player character to Kos in a way that no other weapon connection in the game quite matches. It is, on some level, using a Great One's remains to fight in the space that Great One's death created. The ethics of that are something the game declines to adjudicate. The Hunter's Nightmare, as a whole, is organized around a repeated encounter with the worst things the first generation of hunters did, and the player character moves through it in a direction that is both geographic and historical. The areas of the DLC represent different phases of the early hunt's corruption, from the relatively fresh nightmare of Ludwig's transformation to the ancient, settled consequence of what happened at the fishing hamlet. Moving through the DLC is moving backward through history toward the original sin that produced the nightmare. The final area, the shoreline with Kos's body, is the beginning, the moment before which the chain of consequences that produced everything in the game did not yet exist. Chapter 7. The Blood, the Beasts, and the Transformation. The Old Blood is the foundation of everything in Bloodborne, and the game's treatment of it is one of the most sophisticated pieces of speculative biology in any game I have encountered. It is not simply a magical substance that heals wounds and makes people strong. It is a complex biological agent with specific effects on human physiology, psychology, and cognition, and those effects operate differently depending on dosage, lineage, method of administration, and the individual's specific biological relationship to whatever the blood originally came from. The healing properties of the blood are real. This is important to establish because it is easy to read the blood as simply bad, as a corrupting influence with no genuine benefit. But the Healing Church maintained its institutional position for a significant period of time because the blood worked. People who were sick, injured, or dying received blood ministration and recovered. The healing was not illusory and not simply delayed corruption. It was genuine therapeutic intervention that also happened to have long-term effects that the Church did not disclose to its patients. The long-term effects are what produced the beast scourge. Over generations of blood ministration, the ordinary people of Yharnam accumulated enough old blood exposure that their physiology began to change in ways that the acute healing response had not. The Church understood this was happening. The internal debates documented through item descriptions and environmental storytelling indicate that Church scholars were aware of the transformative potential of sustained blood exposure and disagreed about whether this was a problem to be managed or a process to be guided. The faction that believed transformation could be guided was broadly the choir. The faction that believed it needed to be managed, controlled, and concealed was the dominant political force in the Church. The result was an institution that simultaneously conducted experiments on transforming subjects in its upper levels and told its congregation in the lower levels that the blood was simply holy and healing. The people of Yharnam were not patients who consented to participation in a transformation program. They were subjects who believed they were receiving something simple and were actually being slowly and profoundly changed. The beast transformation itself is a function of this change going wrong, or going too fast, or happening in a body that cannot channel it properly. The evidence for this reading comes from the contrast between beast-type transformations and kin-type transformations. Both are produced by old blood exposure. Both move the transformed individual away from ordinary human physiology, but they move in different directions. Kin transformations produce entities that are alien and inhuman, but cognitively elevated. Beast transformations produce entities that are physically powerful, but cognitively collapsed. The blood is pushing towards something, and different bodies respond to that push in different ways. The role of madness, specifically frenzy, in this dynamic is interesting. Frenzy in Bloodborne is a mechanical status effect produced by exposure to insight pressure. A hunter who accumulates too much frenzy has their insight forcibly increased to a point that the mind cannot sustain, and it produces catastrophic damage. This is the cognitive pathway overloading, in the same way that the physical pathway overloads in beast transformation. The two failure modes, beast and frenzy madness, are mirror images of the same fundamental problem. Human beings are not built to handle what the old blood is pushing toward. Pungent blood cocktails and blood vials. The healing items in the game represent the ordinary distribution of old blood through the Church's system. Blood vials, specifically, are the concentrated form used for healing, and their widespread availability throughout Yharnam suggests that the Church maintained an extensive production and distribution system. Where the blood came from, at scale, is implied to be both from the Chalice Dungeon system and from the population itself. The Church was drawing blood from its congregation and processing it back into blood vials, creating a closed loop where the congregation was both the source and the recipient of the blood. This is alluded to in the Yosefka's clinic questline, where the fake Yosefka is transforming the NPCs sent to the clinic into celestial mob entities. The clinic in the ordinary game is a blood processing facility as much as it is a healing institution. What happens to the people sent there during the night of the hunt is a concentrated and accelerated version of what the Church has been doing with the entire population of Yharnam over generations. Formless Eden is the Great One most directly associated with blood in Bloodborne. Eden has no physical form. He exists only in blood and in the sounds of breathing. Item descriptions associated with Eden indicate that his influence is pervasive throughout the blood supply in Yharnam in a way that is distinct from the other Great One's influences. He is not present as a boss. He is not visible anywhere in the game. He exists in the blood itself, carried by every person in Yharnam who has ever had blood ministration, present in the Church's distribution system, diffused through the entire population. This reading of Eden suggests that the blood was never neutral. Eden's presence in blood, if it has the effects on consciousness that exposure to other Great Ones has, means that every person in Yharnam who received blood ministration was receiving a sustained low-level dose of Great One influence, in a form that the Church either did not recognize or chose not to disclose. The scourge may be Eden's nature, expressing itself through the population he has been diffused into, without Eden having any intention about it, one way or the other. The Odin Chapel Dweller and the various NPCs associated with Eden Chapel provide some of the more grounded human perspectives on the events of the night of the hunt. The Chapel Dweller is afraid and trying to protect the refugees who have gathered there. The people who come to the chapel are the ones who survived long enough to find a place of relative safety. They are not hunters or scholars or church officials. They are ordinary people who thought the blood would protect them, and are now discovering that the night has come regardless. Sending all the NPCs to Iosefka's clinic rather than the chapel produces a different outcome, one that is worse for all of them and provides the player character with insight rewards for each NPC delivered. This mechanic is, in lore terms, the game asking you to choose between the welfare of ordinary people and the pursuit of insight, and providing a concrete reward for choosing insight. The game does not comment on this choice morally, it simply presents it and lets the player make it, which is itself a kind of commentary on what the hunt does to those who participate in it long enough. The Charred Hunter set and the various pieces of equipment associated with specific types of hunters throughout the game tell a history of the hunt's evolution through visual design. The earliest designs are closer to ordinary utility clothing, hunters who were primarily fighting against beasts and needed protection and mobility. The later designs incorporate more arcane elements, more blood processing equipment, more of the Church's aesthetic vocabulary. The evolution of the hunter's visual identity tracks the evolution of the hunt's purpose from beast management to something more complex and more corrupted. The transformation of hunters into beasts is not shown frequently in the game, but the implications of it run throughout the lore. Each hunter the player character fights, who has gone feral or whose behavior suggests they are on the edge of losing themselves, is a demonstration of the endpoint of the hunting life without whatever restraints normal society and the Church's structure provide. The night of the hunt is notable for precisely this reason. It is the night when the restraints came off, when the Church lost its ability to manage the scourge, and hunters, who had been holding themselves together under normal conditions, began to fall apart. The blood of Adeline, obtained by speaking to Adeline in the research hall and progressing her quest line, culminates in Adeline achieving what she was looking for, a direct experience of the cosmos, which she describes in her final dialogue as seeing the sea of stars. She does this by consuming her own brain fluid, which has been used in the research hall's experiments. Her transformation is peaceful compared to most transformations in the game, and she leaves behind the item that allows the player character to purchase the milkweed rune. Her arc is one of the few in the game where the desire to transcend ends in something that looks, from the outside, like genuine peace. The lumen flower enemies in the research hall are patients who have transformed into plant-like bioluminescent entities that produce arcane attacks. They are distinct from the celestial mob enemies in form, but similar in the nature of their transformation, both representing human beings who have been pushed toward kin status through concentrated old blood exposure. The lumen flower form specifically appears to be associated with a particular type of arcane resonance, plants and light being recurring motifs in the areas most directly connected to Great One influence. The research hall's lumen flower patients are, in a terrible way, beautiful, which may be the most disturbing thing about them. The hunter set, found throughout the game in multiple configurations, represents the practical midpoint of hunter equipment design, functional enough for serious hunting but not so specialized that it commits to a particular faction's philosophy. Hunters who wear the standard hunter set are choosing adaptability over identity, which is consistent with the player character's role as an outsider to all of Yharnam's factions. The equipment suits someone who needs to function in every area of the city without advertising allegiance to any of the institutions that would otherwise want to claim them. The executioner set represents the church's most martial face, designed to communicate authority and purpose to anyone who encounters a hunter wearing it. The golden elements reference the sanctification of the hunt, the idea that killing in the church's name is blessed rather than simply violent. Wearing it is a statement, and the statement is that the wearer has the church's backing and operates within the church's framework of justified violence. The fact that this set is worn by a faction whose sole purpose is executing the church's enemies is the church's theology of violence made into wearable form. The Canehurst set, associated with the Vile Blood Knights of Canehurst Castle, represents an older aesthetic that predates the Healing Church's visual language entirely. It is formal, regal, and violent in the specific way that a court culture's armaments are violent, designed to communicate aristocratic identity as much as combat function. Wearing it is claiming connection to something the church spent considerable resources trying to destroy, which is either brave or provocative depending on the context. In the game's narrative context, it is a reminder that the church's enemies were not simply different, but older, with claims to legitimacy that predate the church's own. The Yahagul set, worn by the hunters associated with the school of Mensis, is designed in a way that suggests practical function without the church's aesthetic vocabulary. These hunters were doing something different from the church's hunters, going into spaces the church's hunters did not go, and facing things the church's hunters were not equipped for. Their equipment reflects the specific demands of the Chalice dungeon work and the Mensis ritual preparations, stripped of the church's ceremonial elements in favor of pure functional design. The old hunter garb, found throughout the hunter's nightmare, is a record of the first generation's equipment, what the original hunters wore before the church formalized the hunt and standardized its tools. It is rougher than church equipment, improvised in some details, clearly designed by people working with what was available, rather than with what an institution could provide. The texture and design of old hunter equipment communicates resourcefulness and urgency. A group of people responding to a crisis without the backing of an established institution, doing the best they can with what they have. Chapter 8. The True Architecture of Yharnam's Final Night. The night of the hunt, depicted in Bloodborne, is presented as a single terrible night, but the evidence accumulated through careful reading of the game's lore suggests it is more precisely described as the culmination of a process that has been building for decades, possibly longer. Everything visible on the night of the game's events has a history that stretches back through the founding of the Healing Church, through Byrgenwerth, through the Pthumerian civilization beneath the city, and through the contracts and encounters between human beings and great ones that produced all of it. The blood moon that appears after Rom's death is the most significant transformation event in the game's timeline that the player character directly causes. The world changes fundamentally when the veil is removed. Entities that were present but invisible become visible and active. The amygdalae, previously passive architectural features, become interactive. The nature of Yharnam as a space is revealed to be something other than what it appeared to be before. The blood moon is not simply a visual effect. It is the game's clearest statement that the truth of Yharnam was always there, and that the relative normality of the early game was always a managed lie. The progression of the player character through Yharnam maps onto a progressive revelation of truth. The early game is about beasts and hunters, a relatively comprehensible dynamic. The mid-game introduces the Great Ones and the church's hidden history. The late game is about the fundamental nature of the hunt, the moon presence, and the question of what the player character is going to do with everything they have learned. This structure is deliberate, an architecture of revelation designed to ensure that each new piece of information reframes everything that came before it. The cathedral ward is the geographic center of the Healing Church's visible power, and also the zone of transition between the early game's beast hunting and the mid-game's cosmic material. Its architecture is the most overtly religious in Yharnam, all vaulted spaces and stained glass, and the iconography of blood as holy substance. The enemies within it shift from beast type to kin type as the player character moves deeper into church territory, marking the transition from the church's public face to its private research. The upper cathedral ward and the orphanage within it are where the church's most extreme experiments were housed, and where the celestial emissary and ebrietas are encountered. The orphanage is described in item descriptions as a place where infants with arcane potential were gathered and raised, which suggests that the church understood Great One influence as something that could be hereditary and was systematically identifying and collecting those individuals. What was done with them subsequently is not stated directly, but the context of the orphanage as a research site implies that the children who passed through it were subjects rather than wards.